Dying Church, Living God. That's the title of a new book by Chuck Meyer. Dying Church, Living God is a provocative work about the institutional church. You'll enjoy listening today as we have Chuck Meyer here to talk about this work on Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, in behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, welcoming you to this edition of the show. It was some early centuries that the Christian church began to observe Lent. It was named after the lengthening of the days in the spring, but it was theologically the way of anticipating the coming of Good Friday and Easter, the death that preceded new life. It's appropriate, therefore, that now that we're into the 21st century, that we should have a book written by a local author about death preceding life in regard to the church. The book's title is Dying Church, Living God. It's by Chuck Meyer, chaplain at St. David's Medical Center and the vice president for human operations there. And he is here to tell us about this newest in a series of books. Chuck, we welcome you back.
Well, thanks very much for having me back.
And I think that in the past we've talked about books such as Surviving Death,
Right.
about individuals who were seeking to make adjustment upon the death of loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
We had you talk about your mysteries, your crime fiction.
That's right.
Reverend Lucas Holt.
Lucas Holt.
Now, this is, after how many books have you written altogether?
12.
And this last one is a little different, as I understand, from your earlier ones.
It's a little different. It also, of course, you can tell from the title, still deals with the issue of dying. But dying is related not to individuals, but to an institution, and that institution is the church.
So how did you happen to decide to write this?
Well, decide to write it is a very interesting phrase. The book had to be written, and it's different from books that I have done, that I had an idea for it, sat down, kind of fleshed it out, wrote it. This book kept nagging at me, and as I say actually in the introduction, a part of me actually didn't want to write it. And I kept putting it off and thinking, well, I'll get around to it sometime. But it kept forming in my head. That just the chapters formed and the ideas became really clear, and it just kept saying, do this. So I did. I sat down, and while most books, particularly the mysteries, take about 9 months to do part-time, because I have a full-time job, this book took about 60 days, again, with, of course, full-time work. And so I was working on the book evenings and weekends.
Well, you say that it kind of took possession of you. I mean, it sounded like you were resisting some force out there that kept pressing itself into you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't get too spooky about this, but certainly the book has been formulating for years and years and years with my experience, as I say in the introduction, my own experience in the institutional church, and talking about that experience or listening to other people talk about their experiences for decades.
All right, so a kind of a cumulative effect.
Yeah, kind of cumulative effect, and I don't quite know what brought it to a head. I know that part of it had to do with dealing with my own daughter's experience of the institutional church, and us going to church on a Sunday and then spending a fair amount of time after that debriefing. What was this, and what does this mean?
What was it, or what wasn't it?
Yeah, or what wasn't it? And integrating her other experience into that and trying to pull those two together. There's, as you know, in the 12 Smooth Stones book, there's a chapter on the church, looking at reframing the theology and language that would make sense to a
12
teenager.
Smooth stones, right, that we
Right.
talked about before in
Uh-huh.
an earlier Austin Faith Dialogue with your daughter
That's
here.
right. That's right.
About how to try to, among other things, see if religion could be relevant to
Right.
her and her generation. Well, I think turning to what the book is about, the title says, Dying Church, Living God, A Call to Begin Again.
Right.
Now, you do come to this after being ordained as Episcopal clergy person. You worked in prison system for 10 years.
10 years.
You worked in
St.
St. David's
for
here
20.
20 years. You've had this connection with the church in a sense, not in a parish situation, but nevertheless as a professional.
And have done supply work and substituted and had a small church that I helped out in New York for a number of months when they were between clergy.
All right. So how is the church dying?
Well, let me look at one of the first paragraphs in here to sort of get the flavor of this.
All right.
The basic premise is this: the church is dying. Its structure and theology make no sense today and haven't for decades. Far from being innocuous, their outdated uselessness goes beyond a nostalgic irrelevance to purposeful insidiousness, not just taking up space, but monolithically standing in the way of the Spirit. The dying church impedes God's various attempts at theological and liturgical progress, obviates meaningful spiritual communication and change, and squanders the precious time of people desperately seeking nurture, affirmation, and God.
Now, that's not exactly what you call positive thinking.
Well, it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very positive that the church is dying because the premise is that it cannot be resurrected into the 21st century unless it dies.
All
and
right.
you can't have it both ways. You can't have it hanging on to anachronistic theology and drag that into the next millennium.
Okay, well, besides out-of-date theology, what else is dying about it?
Well, the theology, I think, is a reflection of the, and vice versa, of the structure, the hierarchical structure. I mean, almost every other organization, particularly in business and industry, is flattening their organizational structure, and here the church is still very hierarchical.
Okay.
One of the things that we're seeing, as you and I talked about a little bit before we went on the air, is the plethora of information coming forth about the death of the church. And in fact, there's major backlash between congregation and clergy across the country.
The conflict with
Yeah.
clergy and congregation.
Yes.
You see that as part of the death throes? Of
Absolutely. I think it's part of the death throes of the structure. That the structure no longer functions for God, and God's not going to be held back by it. That it's indicative, I would argue, of a dysfunctional structure. And whereas that hierarchical structure now begins to flatten, we're seeing more and more people form, particularly small groups, to discuss their spiritual needs because they're not being fed. They go to church, come out hungry.
Well, now,
Serpents.
you're just giving an across-the-board indictment of institutional religion.
Well,
or do you find exceptions to that, or I mean, is it dying all from top to bottom? I mean,
yeah, I think it's dying from top to bottom, and I think I'm just stating the obvious. I mean, it's like stating the king has no clothes. Church is dying, and in many places is dead. Now there are pockets, I would suggest, that at least I have seen, you have too, of groups that have been together for maybe decades, and they may be part of an institutional church, but it's almost like they function in spite of it. I was talking to a group here in Austin that I've talked to for probably 10 years now. I go back to their Sunday school class every year. Just they're good friends, and I always they want to drag me back. So anyway, I went back, talked to them about this, and it was very interesting to watch their reaction because what's began to come to the surface was they function as a really tight support group for each other, and have through young marrieds to having kids to now having kids be off in college.
right?
Almost as kind of a separate cell. And so that even if the institutional church were to die, that group would still go on because they're not wedded to it. They're almost a separate pod from it.
Right, right. So you see in these small support groups the people finding their spirituality nurtured.
Yeah. There's a book called Letters at 3 a.m. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. He lives in California and writes for the Chronicle. He talked about years ago traveling around the country and seeing these small groups of people pulling together out of mutual need to discuss spiritual issues.
Okay. But you know, the thing that really struck me was that in your saying that the institutional church is in this last days, in a sense, here are the mega churches that are growing number-wise, institutionally.
You might say metastasizing.
Well, I mean, you say that this is part of the death throes of the church.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's a last-ditch effort at trying to create a kind of an enclave, Christian enclave, that's doomed to fail. Because as was said about Oakland, there's no there there. You can drag people in and you can put on a show and you can do the big screen and you can have lots of music and you can have preaching that sounds like TV evangelists, and people will go home hungry.
But you don't see that as necessarily happening right away. I mean, this is a long process.
I think it's a longer-term process, but I do think it's further evidence of the death throes of the church.
Well, I think in the second half of the show, we'll come to the second part of your title. We're talking about dying church here for the most part, but then we'll give some emphasis to living God as we come back.
That's where the action is.
And I have to say that even the titles of your chapters, from snafu to foobar, what does that mean?
The situation, normal, all fouled up, and foobar is fouled up beyond all recognition.
And you're saying that describes the church.
That's where we are.
And then you're saying...
those chapters basically describe how we got there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you're talking about Our Lady of the X-Files and Zorba.
That's right.
What is that all about?
Well, that's about talking about what the impact will be on our belief about God in particular, and the church also, but particularly about God, and how we will deal with theology once we come to terms with life elsewhere in the universe.
I see. And certainly in a technological age with obsolete forms, it seems it raises that question too. How does the church be relevant in this ever-changing setting? Well, what's relevant now is that we've got to stop, take a break. And when we do come back, we'll talk more to Chuck Meyer about this obviously provocative book. Stay with us. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today we're in conversation with Chuck Meyer, local author of the new book entitled Dying Church, Living God. And we're connecting this, Chuck, with the fact that this is Lent, that it's a season anticipating Good Friday and Easter, where there is a death before resurrection.
Well, that depends on which church you go to.
Okay.
One of the things I talk about in the book is the church's own inability to deal with death in general. And as you know, there are study questions actually in the back of the book that we're hoping that the book is used partly for Lenten study, partly for maybe for individual spiritual study, But one of the questions in the book is, when you go to church Good Friday, and maybe it'll change having people heard this show, but when you go to church Good Friday, keep track of how many times you hear the word Easter and resurrection and empty tomb. Mm-hmm. It's like we can't even, on the one day of the year when the issue is death, talk about death. Mm-hmm. It's like reading the end of the mystery story before you got there.
So
we don't know resurrection's happened yet.
See the culture and the church still in denial about death.
Big time denial. We can't even get through Good Friday. In the Episcopal Church, as you know, we strip the altar and leave the church in darkness.
Yeah.
As real mourning and symbolizing the death of Jesus, because we don't know what's going to happen yet. And that's what makes the good news such great news. A couple days later is the big surprise of the empty tomb.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to this living God part of it, but I have to ask you one other thing.
Uh-oh.
There was, I thought, particularly helpful way of putting in perspective what you're saying, that the church living in this changing world with all of this incredible 21st century type stuff, still functioning, it seems like, in the Middle Ages in some way.
Yeah, well, talk about apartheid's dead in South Africa. The Berlin Wall's been now, 10 years? We're seeing geopolitical formations that we've not seen before. We're seeing just incredible increases in technology and communication.
Tell us about AT&T.
Well, and P.S. to that, the church is still conducting Sunday services on 19th century milking schedules.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
right.
Okay. But this analogy to AT&T is
yeah, well,
they're not on a milking schedule.
They're not. AT&T is not a milking. The story I tell in there, one of the interesting metaphors is apparently, this is not an apocryphal story apparently, that in the early 70s, the president of AT&T called managers together into one room and said, here's the deal, close the door, everybody sit down. Here's the deal, I have some very astonishing news. And they all said, oh, something must have happened, stock must have fallen or something disastrous. He said, the telephone as you have always known it no longer exists. Make a new one. And there were these giggles, and he said, and furthermore, anybody who doesn't believe that can pick up their check, hit the door. It sort of got their attention. So for the next couple hours, they sat around in small groups, reinventing or inventing a telephone. And they said stuff like, yeah, it'd be really nice to have one without that stupid cord on it, And everybody went, cordless, way out of your mind. Well, I'd like to be notified if I was on the phone and somebody's trying to get me. Well, yeah, wouldn't it be nice to have a phone in the car? Well, wouldn't it be nice if you could, if you weren't home, the call could go somewhere else? So they came up with, I don't know, it's like 60 different items, some of which they haven't implemented yet. So the parallel is, imagine that maybe on Easter Sunday, who knows, show up at the vacant lot where your church used to be, and there's a little note tacked on a rock from God, and it says, the church as you have always known it no longer exists. Make a new one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for that segue to the living God who communicates to us by, in effect, saying that. You're saying in the book.
Yeah.
But you talk about the leaking God. What is that about?
Well, it's the metaphor of the microwave. The way to check and see if you have a leak in your microwave, believe it or not, is that you take a fluorescent bulb, put something in your microwave, and turn it on, and you hold the fluorescent bulb around the seal of the microwave. And if the bulb lights up, you got a leak. Well, that's the metaphor for how we tell where God is. God's leaking all over the place, and leaking outside the church walls, leaking in small groups, leaking in popular literature, perhaps, leaking in very non-traditional religions, leaking in other religions that are coming to bear on Christianity. Mm-hmm. Even some of the New Age stuff, that as much as people discount that, what's going on with that? Why is that so popular? Well, it's because God's leaking over there. Mm-hmm. And if you hold up the fluorescent bulb of, do the blind receive sight? Are the sick healed? Are the poor taken care of? Are we walking humbly with God? Is there justice being done? If those are kind of the fluorescent bulb that you hold up, God lights up all over.
Okay, so it's an analogy and an image, and how does it go along with the biblical one about Joseph? Or no, not Joseph, but Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Well, the way that the church, I think, will become resurrected, move out of the empty tomb, is with the title chapter is called Wrestling Toward Resurrection. And that what we are meant to do is grapple with God. I mean, really get down and dirty and grapple. And people generally don't want to do that because, just like Jacob, they know what the outcome will be. The reason Jacob didn't want to grapple and wrestle with the angel was because he knew what would happen. And what happened was he got a new name. It wasn't a name he wanted. It wasn't a name that he anticipated. And it was a name that took him in a very different direction.
A new identity.
New identity. And that's what's going on, I would suggest, with us and the Holy Spirit.
All right. Well, now I would like to just imagine this angel where church is wrestling with, saying things like you say in your book, give up your tax-exempt status.
Yeah, I think one of the signs of the resurrected church will be, I mean, if you're really serious about this, we need to take our public citizenship seriously. And we ought to pay taxes. We ought to pay sales taxes. We ought to pay state taxes if there are any in the different states. We ought to pay, if there's income, we ought to pay income taxes. We ought to pay for police, fire, and ambulance.
Organized religion ought to carry its weight as far as the taxes.
Absolutely. And if you can't do it, then maybe there's a reason for that.
Well, that's not quite controversial enough. So let's try this other idea that you've got here. Give up your Sunday schools.
I think that's true. And that's actually not all that new an idea. Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. did that 30 years ago. They decided that rather than spending all this time and money trying to teach kids stuff, they would teach the parents. Which goes to the other piece in there is that the suggestion is made that we ought to have a 10-year moratorium on building churches. You just got to ask, why is it that in a culture where we're more and more communicating directly on the internet or with other different means of communication, why is it that we're still building boxes to drag people into 20 or 30 at a time to teach them things on marker boards with pieces of paper? I don't get it. It just doesn't make good logical sense.
So what, I mean, are you talking about the substitute for Sunday school on the internet? Is that your idea?
I don't know where this is going to go. I don't even pretend to know or to have all the answers. But certainly there are, one of the evidences that I talk about for the resurrected church, it will be cyber functional. And instead of doing little church leaflets, we'll have everybody have a computer and they'll all be on email and we can communicate to them that way. And maybe even project the service that way if you have a service. The thing that I mentioned too is if the church was really interested in family values, in the year 2000, when we have a lot of dual working couples that got to work because what things cost, if we really valued family values, why wouldn't we have church Thursday night and give people a 3-day weekend they could spend with their kids? Or with each other, instead of dragging out Sunday morning, dressing your kids, which is always a fun time, dragging them off to church where they sit there and either crayon or make 10 excuses to go to the bathroom, and fight and argue till you get home and get that tie off.
You don't see that as a study in Christian discipleship.
Oh, a study in Christian punishment, perhaps. I don't know.
Doing penance. Maybe.
Doing penance, yeah, for the rest of the week.
Yeah. Well, back to your chapter titles.
Yeah.
Okay. This one is called No Religion 2.
Right.
And I think a Bonhoeffer is saying something about, that we may be entering into an era that where there's not religion. But he's not confusing that, though, with faith in God.
Exactly. Exactly. I perfectly agree. Heretofore, the church has served as the medium, the communicating factor, the process through which tradition, faith, values have been communicated.
All right.
And maybe did very effectively. I'm not discounting that at all. And for 2,000 years, or maybe a little less than that, It did it very, very effectively, very powerfully. The question is, what next? And for all that time, we've been interested in religion, which comes from, you know, the Latin words religio, which means to rebind.
Okay.
And so that the function of religion, the function of the church, has been to rebind people with God on the assumption that we're separate, and that what we need to do is come back together and be rebound, religio. What I'm suggesting is maybe the next step in that, and what we're seeing around the country in spirituality busting out all over, is moving from religio to in spiritu, to breathing in, moving from rebinding to becoming one with the Spirit of God, to breathing the breath of God, which is a very different image.
Okay. Well,
and a hopeful one, very powerful.
Well,
hopeful
I think
one.
so. I think the one thing, though, about religion in its origin is binding people. It's a community by its very nature. In spiritu can be taken just as the individual relationship to God. I mean,
Sure it can, but we exist in community, and I think that's really the challenge. Is to figure out how do we do this as a community.
How can you be nurtured spiritually as an individual and yet do this in the context of community life? And
I think that's where we're going.
By the way, if people want to go and get a copy of this book, and either in order to burn it, or to give it to somebody, or to read it and keep it forever,
or sneak it in the back door of your church, spread around about 10 different copies, and start the revolution.
If for any of those reasons they want to go and get it, where do they go?
Well, they can get it at any of the local bookstores, of course, Barnes & Noble and Bookstop. Northwest Hills Pharmacy, St. David's Hospital, gift shop carries it. Book People, it's on Amazon.
What about the
trunk of my car?
Trunk of your car? You told me before the show you're carrying around the trunk of your car, for heaven's sake.
Oh, of course, sure. Life is short.
Okay, well, and you know, this is so fascinating because here you are during the daytime working as, and I incorrectly said the Vice President for Human Operations. It's just plain operations, right?
That's right.
And at St. David's, and overseeing the chaplaincy program there as well. And but you keep on writing all this stuff while you're working at this other job. And is this like a genie or something that?
Well, as we talked on one of the earlier shows, it's a compulsion. Writers have to write. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. We have to read some of this stuff because it's really great stuff, whether we're in Austin, Texas, or anywhere in the country. We hope that people do read Chuck Meyer and this new book.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for being here, Chuck.
Thanks for having me here.
And we're pleased that you folks join us. I'm Richard Thompson, and again, on behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, urging you to be with us next week. And peace be with you.